Hello everyone and welcome. In today's conversation, we'll talk about how companies can squeeze information from the massive amount of data being generated and captured by machines and sensors in their supply chain. Right now, there's a lot of buzz out there around artificial intelligence, cognitive computing, machine learning. We'll dig into those advanced analytics and how they can be brought to bear to solve your problems. My name is Dan Mitchell. I'm the Director of Retail and Consumer Goods Industry Practice here at SAS. I'm your moderator for today. I'd like to introduce you to our guests of experts who are joining us on the webcast. First, Laura Cecere, the founder of Supply Chain Insights, which is a firm that provides thought-leading supply chain research. She works with supply chain leaders around the world in helping those teams reach a higher level of excellence. She's an all-around supply chain guru. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
Also joining us is Rich Mather. He's an analytics expert here at SAS, and he knows a lot about machine learning and cognitive computing. Welcome, Rich and Laura.
Thanks. Very excited to be here.
Well, let's get started. How much will machine learning and cognitive computing really transform the supply chain?
Oh, I think it doesn't look anything like it does today. First of all, if you look at decision support, which demand planning, production planning, transportation planning, trade promotion planning, those are all decision support tools. But they don't work very well today because we don't clean the data going into them very well, and we don't embrace planning master data, and the engines are very constrained based upon some outdated concepts of the 1990s, 64-bit architectures and linear optimization, and so it allows us to sense, test, and learn, and instead of getting exceptions, we're going to have machines that are going to make decisions for us and then give us advice about what we should do. So I think we're on the crux of the redefinition of decision support and insight systems for companies and business processes.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think you're going to see just more automation, just a more algorithmic-driven supply chain. Within the different supply chain disciplines, you're going to see more automation. A lot of that domain expertise, that subject matter expertise that may have been executed by an analyst in the past, those kind of operational, more transactional type of processes are now going to be more automated. And I think the same is true across the supply chain. I think you see in a lot of cases there's a lot of these different disciplines within the supply chain are pretty siloed. They kind of manage their own world. And I think you're going to see a lot of connection of data and a lot of decisions across the entire supply chain as well.
You're both speaking to customers constantly. Do you think they have a firm grasp on the difference between these capabilities, whether it's cognitive or artificial intelligence, machine learning? Where are they in their understanding, and where are they maybe in their maturity to take that first step and use one of these analytics technologies on a problem that they have right in front of them?
Well, Dan, I think the definitions are all a mush in the market. We don't have clear taxonomies, and I think we're overhyping the technologies. And I also think that we are not asking the right questions. So instead of, are people ready for this, right? It's a missionary sell. I think we've got to, as technologists, say, how can we use these new technologies to reinvent business processes instead of going out and saying to a client, are you ready for cognitive computing? You remember, Ford said, if I asked my customers if they wanted a new thing, they would have said a faster horse, not a car. So I don't think we can ask people, are they ready for cognitive computing? And I think what we've got to say is, here is a new way of doing decision support where you're more effective, you answer questions differently. So instead of having concurrent optimization as we know it today, or only using structured data, that we use unstructured and structured data. We have rules-based ontologies, and we redefine rule sets. Would we like to have an available to promise signal where we have many ifs to many thens and it learns? Yeah. Would we like to match inventory and orders in a way where we have demand insights for many to many rule sets? Absolutely, because we do that badly. Right. Would we like to be able to know what market signals are and to be able to read markets? Yeah, but we're still stuck in traditional demand paradigms. So I think as technologists, we've got to learn about the technologies, define them well in the market, and help business buyers to see the future by packaging them to solve new problems.
Do you think that the explosion of channels where customers can shop are basically putting that pressure on our current decisioning systems? There's just too many dimensions now that a traditional decision-making system that they're using in-house that they might have right now is just failing, and that's going to kind of be the fuel for some of this change, adopting these technology, or
no?
No.
I think cognitive computing is going to come from bigger problem sets. Things like, how do we improve healthcare?
Okay.
How do we dramatically improve transportation for smart cities? How do we drive autonomous vehicles? How do we redefine business processes? At the core of supply chain processes, we don't sense and we respond. We do not drive insights very well. And so it requires a whole redefinition, but we've got to be open to it. And we need technologists like Seth to come and package those solutions so that the buyer can see the future. We can't just ask the buyer.
I think if you just look at the data that you currently have today, there's so much opportunity to start connecting the different parts of the supply chain together. Where in the past, if you think of a typical predictive analytics or machine learning, you might see that we predict that this shipment is going to be late, or monthly sales next month are going to be X, or within the manufacturing space, you may predict that you're going to have a catastrophic failure for a particular asset 2 weeks from now. I think the question is, okay, well, what do you do with that? I think in the past that's required a lot of domain expertise, where an analyst or a technician in the manufacturing plant have applied their subject matter expertise to try to resolve that. And I think what you're going to see is, as you start to connect the different data points across the supply chain, you can start to think of different scenarios. If I see a demand spike in my sales, how do I handle that? What's the optimal solution? Do I make more product? Can my suppliers handle the additional product that we're making? How does that affect the current orders that we have and the inventory levels? So there's a lot of different ways to handle that single spike in sales. How do you determine what the optimal solution is? And I think that's where AI and cognitive computing is going to really help manage the business better by thinking of the different scenarios and giving you that optimal solution.
But I think a good place to start is with machine learning on master data. We think about the supply chain and we think about decision support tools, whether they're forecasting or tactical supply planning or transportation management or available to promise. We have this layer of supply chain master data that's really untethered and unmanaged. So things like cycles or lead times are not fixed numbers. They vary a lot, based upon the season, based upon what's happening. And things like items, an item master at one company is very different than an item master at another. And an item's not an item, an order's not an order. And so this whole supply chain master data is a place that we can start with pattern recognition to make the inputs to the engines better. The redefinition of the engines through cognitive computing, I think we've got to think about. In the 1990s, when we first had decision support, it was limited by memory. We had to chunk up the problem because we couldn't stuff everything into memory. That's no longer our issue, and we have a lot more power. So should trade promotion be different than demand planning? Should market insights be a separate function? Should transportation be separate from warehouse management? Should, tactical planning and production planning be done together? Those definitions start to be important questions because now we have more power. And do I need planners?
It's controversial, but
I think we maybe need one or two planners, and they look really different than the hundreds of planners we have now in the global organization. And that level of automation requires us to test and learn and evolve. And I think what's going to happen is, out of the autonomous vehicle world, we're going to start to see cognitive computing evolve that will be adopted into decision support.
Okay. So that's, you really see it. That's where it's really going to all the kinks will be worked out of it there. We'll really be able to understand all the nuances and then apply it to all those learnings to supply chain.
I don't think we'll get all the nuances out.
Well, enough that we feel dangerous.
We'll get over the hurdle, right?
Yes,
we're going to go past the passive data scientist model, which the passive data scientist model with data lakes is also dangerous, right? Because people think that we're just going to do data mining on data lakes and that's the end state. But the cognitive computing that's going to happen out of autonomous vehicles, whether it's the Google work or it's the work that's happening with Amazon on delivery, is going to bring that past the missionary phase that people are going to start to say, well, maybe I could adopt it for X or Y. But I think we've got to package the solutions for the buyers so that we can educate them. This is a missionary cell, and this is a step change. This is not an evolution.
Right, right. Are there some segments or industries where they're able to maybe take that first step before some of the other bigger companies? If you look out on the horizon, who do you see out there first who's adopting some of these analytic capabilities and changing their business?
So 7% of manufacturers today are using some form of cognitive computing, but it looks very different by different industries. So in semiconductor, it's around quality and fabs, and how do I sense to improve those processes? Very expensive, very important. In pharmaceuticals, it's around stage gate and trials, and how do I improve getting new drugs to market? In consumer products, it's more around how do I truly get demand insights and use market sensing to drive outside-in processes. In retail, it's more about the basket and the omni-channel. All are equal opportunity love machines for cognitive computing.
Okay.
Yeah, I think just from my personal experience, I think you see obviously a lot of variation across industries. I think you see a lot of variation even within an industry. And I find it interesting even working with companies that even within a company, there's a lot of variation too in the different part where they're at in terms of applying machine learning or AI at the different parts of the supply chain. So they may be quite advanced from a demand planning perspective, but they haven't really leveraged their IoT and sensor information, and they're just kind of starting that journey today.
Okay.
I also think robotics is a really great area. We're going to have robotics supervisors and, the programming of robotics and the connection of Internet of Things with robotics to drive digital manufacturing. And I think that will drive learning that people will say, well, maybe I could apply it to this area. I think right now we need to step back. We need to learn about the new technologies. We need to be very clear on the definitions between pattern recognition, machine learning, cognitive computing. We need to manage the hype cycle and really not put all these pretty words on PowerPoints. And we need technologists like SAS to really help us with what that new opportunity is. And I'm hoping you're not limited in your delivery there.
Yeah, absolutely. I see, too, the other challenge these organizations have is, yes, they're bringing these devices in. There's very little standards across them. The data formats, the data that you're interested in cherry picking out of there varies from organization to organization. You need some of this higher power capabilities like machine learning and like you said, pattern recognition to be able to reach in there and pull out what you want and sort of ignore the rest of the data, let it fly by, and then be able to react really quickly to that.
Right, and I think some of the work that you're doing on sentiment analysis and mining unstructured data and the pattern recognition there is a good place for people to start as well. Because organizations don't listen very well. They're so used to yelling the message. They're out of touch with the market. So that's a good place to start as well.
Yeah, and I've personally had some experience using natural language processing just on reviews. I mean, you'd be surprised that when it comes to website reviews, what's the status quo for using that data is much lower than you'd think. And big companies who have a lot of reviews on their websites, sometimes the people who are managing those products, they don't have the time to go even look at them. They're like, I don't get paid to do that. I don't have the time to go look at all those reviews. Meanwhile, we all agree it's influencing the shopping decisions. So there's a lot of opportunity there to get at some of that unstructured data with some of these advanced techniques.
We've had several successes of that combination of taking your unstructured data and looking at products that are already in the field and taking, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and combining that with your structured data to try to detect potential quality issues after they've been released into the market, and then alerting the engineer of a potential emergent issue and then giving them contributing factors so they can get to a root cause and fix a product. And we're seeing, just by taking and using that data and applying these algorithms, almost a 50% decrease in resolution time for the customer. Another example of where a company took that was they actually used it to not only detect quality issues, but perceptual quality issues. So the product itself is designed as specified.
Right.
It met all of the requirements. They put it into the field, and when the customers were buying it, there was a certain segment of customers that expected something else. It wasn't performing as they expected. And they used that to launch an entirely new product into the field. So it's pretty powerful in terms of product innovation as well.
You know, sometimes, Dan, I introduce the supply chain team to the digital marketing team, and we start with, let's list all the forms of unstructured data. And now let's think about how we can mine that unstructured data to answer new questions, whether it's rating reviews, it's sentiment analysis, it's warranty data, it's quality data,
Yep.
it's consumer comments. And then how could we use rules-based ontologies and cognitive computing to answer questions that we would like to answer together and redefine processes? And I think it requires that kind of cross-functional thinking that isn't really entrapped by today's paradigms to really take the power of these technologies and really put them into practice to drive value.
So I'm sure they're really excited about that when you introduce them to that. And then what's their next step? I mean, do they start to integrate some of their processes across departments to have some of those, actually work with the marketing team, not just take their data?
Well, first they go, really? They want to talk to us, right?
Yeah.
And you talk to the digital marketing guys, and they're like, why would I want to talk to the supply chain guys? Now, once you get over that hurdle, things get a little better. And so often I start with an exercise of let's draw a supply chain, and people will go, and I have crayons on the table, right? But the supply chain team, when they pick up that crayon, 100% of the time starts with drawing the supplier. And the digital marketing team, 100% of the time, starts with drawing something in digital marketing. And then when we talk about, well, how can we use these signals to improve outcomes, we get the excitement.
Okay. Yeah.
But we have to get outside the box of making efficient silos, right? Which includes marketing for marketing or sales for sales or operations for operations. Efficient silos do not create effective supply chains.
Right. Yeah, I can see the trap of just because we're sharing data that all of a sudden, yes, we're efficient, but we're really not making joint decisions together.
Yeah.
We're just sharing data.
And we're using it inside out, right? Listening requires we're outside in.
Right.
Market sensing and adapting requires that we're outside in. And learning organizations need to really use the power of these new tools.
Yeah, and absolutely. And just when we were talking about that, I was thinking, the marketers definitely, they have a lot to learn also from knowing the vendor and how they're doing their business and how they're designing that product and where it fits in and what changes they have down the road for that product, and thinking about that whole customer life cycle of, well, what are they going to buy next? Are they going to buy another one of these pair of sneakers in a month or a year? Or is it kind of a product where they're looking for the next best feature?
Or how's the new product launch doing, right? We have a tough time rating the market, right? And the typical new product launch has 80% demand error and probably about 60% bias. And we stuff the channel, and, if we're not really listening, we think it's selling really well. But our slow and obsolete write-offs come from the fact that we don't know when to make that second production run. We don't know how to source for that next replenishment order. And we don't have good processes across the organization to make those decisions. So there's some real tangible benefits. But we've got to walk before we run, and we've got to define, we've got to change our own paradigms, and we've got to be able to design with the goal in mind.
So another question I have is just, from an organizational perspective, where can they get started to change this journey of adopting cognitive machine, artificial intelligence? Where do you see those first steps that an organization can change?
Sure. I think, as Laura said earlier, I think the first thing is obviously understanding where you are today. That's kind of your first step. if it's an organization that may not have an executive leader that's overseeing the entire supply chain, that cross-functional team is very important to understand kind of the gaps and opportunities, and making the data scientists part of that process too. So they're aware of the different types of challenges that they're seeing across the entire supply chain. And I think from there, it's identifying some use cases, some small use cases where you can start to apply these techniques that extend your capabilities. So I think, to your point, it's not just about making a process more efficient, it's how do you actually extend your capabilities with these newer technologies. I think for me, it's still important to connect that back to the business, and that's why I think having the data scientist part of that cross-functional team to make sure that it's not a data science project, or it goes on for years without an end goal. I think it's so important that you have success criteria and you're communicating that with the business early on too.
I think an enlightened leader starts with a hairy problem.
Okay.
Whether it's counterfeit goods or gray goods, or how do I listen and how do I solve a quality problem, I think we start with a problem. And then I think we let a team solve that problem without having a fixed ROI, right? We don't shove it into a paradigm and say, I've got to have a defined project plan with a fixed ROI. We let process innovation really work. And then I think we don't limit it by existing paradigms. I think we've got to be open to the outcomes. And I think that's the hard part, is we tend to want to stuff things into functional silos and rote kind of processes. And I think we've got to be honest with ourselves that these processes are evolving, and we're on the cusp of redefining the decision support tools, and they're going to be obsolete. And it should be our goal to make them obsolete quickly, because we have great opportunity.
So demand more. You know, we need the most cutting edge decisioning tools out there. One thing I latched onto that you were discussing is that even just using machine learning to sew some of your data together, that data is moving so fast now that standard data warehouse ETL, that's not going to cut it at all. And you're always bringing in new data stores. So how can we have a layer that's sewing together all this data and not just joining it, but actually pulling out patterns and helping us understand what's happening in the data. So it's definitely an exciting time for a supply chain when it comes to these technologies. We'll see how it changes things over the next couple of years. I want to thank you both for joining us today. It was a great discussion. So now what? What's your next step? We'll hope you join us for the third installment of this webcast series, Demand Planning for Omnichannel Analytics, on October 17th. We'll be lucky to have Laura join us again, and Rick Davis from Kellogg Company, and my colleague Charlie Chase, who's an industry expert for supply and demand planning. In that session, we'll discuss the best way to marry together people, process, and data available to the supply chain analyst today. Thank you very much for joining us today, and have a great day.